The USS Enterprise was the most successful warship in American history. At least, that is the official position. And for once, the official position is not an exaggeration. She earned 20 battle stars, more than any other ship in the United States Navy. And she took part in more of the major actions against Japan than any other American vessel, from the morning of Pearl Harbor to the last months of the war. Her aircraft sank the first Japanese warship lost in the Pacific War, 10 days after Pearl Harbor. Her planes were over the harbor during the attack itself. She was at Midway, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz, at the Philippine Sea, at Leyte Gulf, at Guadalcanal, off the coast of Japan. Her crews claimed more than 900 enemy aircraft and over 70 ships. The men who served on her called her the Big E, and the fleet called her the fightingest ship in the Navy, and she was the most decorated American ship of the entire Second World War. And all of that is true, and none of it is what this is about. Because being aboard the most successful carrier in the war meant being aboard the one that fought the most, was hit the most, and came nearest to death the most. The United States began the Pacific War with a handful of aircraft carriers, and within a year, most of them were on the bottom. The Lexington was sunk at the Coral Sea. The Yorktown was sunk at Midway. The Wasp was sunk off Guadalcanal. The Hornet was sunk at Santa Cruz. And for a stretch of that autumn of 1942, after the Hornet went down, the Enterprise was the only operational American aircraft carrier in the entire Pacific Ocean. Damaged, patched together, thrown back into the fight because there was nothing else to send. 3 separate times during the war, the Japanese announced that they had sunk her, and 3 times they were wrong, and the men who lived through that on her decks paid for the honor of the 20 battle stars with 3.5 years of very nearly continuous combat. Not sunk, not withdrawn. Still there, again and again, when everything around her was gone. This is the story of what it was to live aboard the ship that would not die. Not the glory, which is real and which has filled a shelf of books. The other part, the reality of the men inside her, on a ship that spent the war in the fire because she was too good and too badly needed to be spared it. The war found her at sea, which is where she spent most of it. On the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, the Enterprise was returning to Pearl Harbor from a mission to Wake Island, and she had flown a group of her scout bombers ahead of the ship to land at the Naval Air Station, and those aircraft arrived over Oahu in the middle of the Japanese attack. They flew into a sky full of enemy planes and American anti-aircraft fire that could not tell friend from foe, and several were shot down, and 8 of her airmen were killed, and the Enterprise thus became the only American carrier to lose men in the attack that began the war, before she had even reached port. Her commander, Admiral William Halsey, looking at the wreckage of the battleship fleet, is said to have sworn that before the Navy was done with them, the Japanese language would be spoken only in hell. The Enterprise fueled and rearmed and was back at sea within hours, hunting. And she did not really stop for 3.5 years. In the first weeks of the war, when the country was reeling and there was almost nothing to hit back with, it was the carriers, and above all the Enterprise, that carried the fight to the enemy, raiding Japanese-held islands across the Central Pacific and striking the Marshalls and the Gilberts in February of 1942 in the first American offensive action of the war. On that raid, she was bombed, and a damaged Japanese aircraft, unable to make it home, deliberately tried to crash into her, clipping her deck and cartwheeling into the sea, a first grim foreshadowing of the suicide attacks that would very nearly finish her 3 years later. From the first month to the last, this was the pattern of her war, out and into the fire, and back and out again. Start with what the ship actually was, because the ship was a machine for a specific and dangerous purpose. The Enterprise was a Yorktown-class carrier, launched in 1936 and commissioned in 1938, one of only 3 American carriers built before the war that survived it. She was about 809 feet long, displacing some 20,000 tons empty and better than 25,000 fully loaded, and she carried around 90 aircraft. She was fast, better than 32 knots, driven by 4 screws and a great engineering plant deep in her hull. She had been designed, before the war, to a set of assumptions that the war would rewrite almost immediately, and she would spend the next several years being modified, upgunned, and crammed with more equipment and more men than her designers had ever imagined, growing heavier and more crowded with every refit. And she was, like every aircraft carrier, a floating airfield, which is to say a floating fuel depot and ammunition dump. To operate her aircraft, she carried hundreds of thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline and a magazine full of bombs and torpedoes and ammunition, and the daily work of the ship was the handling of all of it, pumping the fuel, hoisting the ordnance, arming and fueling and launching and recovering aircraft over and over, in every kind of weather and every kind of danger. The aircraft themselves changed as the war went on, and the men changed with them. In the early years, she flew the Douglas Dauntless dive bomber, the SBD, which would prove the war-winning aircraft at Midway, the Douglas Devastator torpedo bomber, the TBD, already obsolete and about to be slaughtered, and the Grumman Wildcat fighter, the F4F, outclassed in some ways by the Japanese Zero, but rugged and deadly in the right hands. Later came the Grumman Avenger torpedo bomber, the TBF, and the Grumman Hellcat, the F6F, the fighter that would break the back of Japanese naval air power. Each type had to be armed and fueled and maintained and launched and recovered by hand, dozens of times a day. And the men who did that work, the ordnance men and the mechanics and the plane handlers, were the ones the whole Enterprise rested on. And they did it in the open, on a steel deck, in all weathers, next to running engines and spinning propellers and thousands of gallons of gasoline. The Americans had learned to build their carriers with open hangars, the great aircraft servicing space left unenclosed at the sides so that fumes could disperse and explosions could vent outward over the sea and burning aircraft could be pushed over the side. And they had built damage control organizations that were the best in the world. And those two facts are a large part of why the Enterprise survived what she survived. But no design and no training could change the fundamental truth of the thing. She was a ship full of gasoline and high explosive, and everyone aboard her lived with that. Now the men, because there were a great many of them, packed into a hull that was never meant to hold so many. The Enterprise had been designed for a crew of a little over 2,000. By the middle of the war, with the extra anti-aircraft guns and the radar and the fire control equipment and the men to work all of it, she carried closer to 2,700, and at times more than that, 3,000 men living inside one hull. A very few of them, a couple of hundred at most, were the aviators, the pilots, and air crew who flew the missions and who were, in the culture of the ship, the reason it existed. Everyone else, the overwhelming majority, existed to keep those aircraft flying and to keep the ship alive, and they lived and worked in conditions the aviators, with their ready rooms and their status, only partly shared. There were the ordnancemen who armed the aircraft, hauling the bombs and belting the ammunition and loading the torpedoes, heavy and dangerous work performed on a moving deck. There were the plane handlers of the flight deck and the hangar deck who spotted and moved and fueled the aircraft. There were the plank owners and the deck seamen and the signalmen and the radio men and the cooks and the corpsmen. There were the gunners, hundreds of them, who manned the anti-aircraft batteries, the 5-inch guns and the 40mm and 20mm mounts that ring the ship, standing exposed at their weapons through every attack. And far below, in the engineering spaces, was the Black Gang, the men who ran the boilers and the turbines, a third of the crew, living in the heat and the noise in the deepest part of the ship. The most dangerous place on the ship, in the ordinary course of things, and before the enemy was even considered, was the flight deck. Launching and recovering aircraft is among the most hazardous routine work human beings perform. And it was more so then, with heavier aircraft, weaker brakes, and none of the safety systems that would come later. The deck crews, the men the Navy called Airedales, worked in a controlled frenzy as the ship steamed into the wind, spotting the aircraft for launch, ranging them, and then, when a strike returned, recovering them one at a time, each landing a deliberate controlled crash onto a moving deck, the plane catching an arrestor wire and slamming to a stop a few feet from the aircraft parked ahead. A snapped wire could cut a man in half. A plane that missed the wires and floated over the crash barrier could plow into the aircraft parked forward and touch off a fire. A spinning propeller could kill a man who stepped the wrong way. And men were, in fact, walked into propellers in the noise and the wind and the exhaustion. A plane going over the side took its crew with it. On a ship flying hundreds of sorties, the accidents alone, with no enemy anywhere near, killed and maimed men steadily, and the Enterprise pioneered flying at night, launching and recovering her aircraft in total darkness when other carriers could not, which multiplied every one of these dangers and meant her deck crews worked around the clock in conditions that pushed men past the edge of what fatigue and concentration could bear. The flight deck killed its own, quietly, all through the war, in the gaps between the battles. Every one of those men had signed on to a machine that would spend the war being shot at, and most of them were very young, and most of them had never been to sea before the Navy took them. They came from everywhere, farm boys and city boys, out of the small towns and the tenements and the ranches of a country that had been in a depression a few years before, drawn into a Navy that had exploded in size almost overnight, and that trained them fast and sent them to sea faster. They were teenagers, most of them, 17 and 18 and 19 and 20, and the war would ask more of them, physically and otherwise, than anything they would ever do again in their lives. Holding it all together was a thin layer of professionals, the career petty officers and the regular officers, the men who actually knew how the ship worked and who taught the flood of new hands on the job, at sea, in combat, which is the hardest possible classroom. And these were the men, the boys, and the few old hands who would keep the most successful warship in American history alive through 3.5 years of fire, and who would pay for her 20 battle stars in a currency the record does not print. The daily conditions of their lives were the conditions of every warship, sharpened by the size of the crew and the length of the deployments. Berthing was cramped, men sleeping in bunks stacked several high and compartments packed tighter than the ship had been designed for. In the heat, in the noise, with no privacy and no quiet and no way off. In the tropics, the interior of the ship became an oven, the steel holding the heat, the ventilation pushing warm, wet air through spaces full of running machinery and crowded men. The engineering spaces ran past 120 degrees. Men sweated through their clothes and their bedding, and slept poorly, and stood their watches, and did it again the next day, and the next for months on end. They ate in shifts in mess spaces that ran almost around the clock to feed 3,000 men. And the food followed the familiar curve, fresh at the start of a long operation and then canned and dehydrated and monotonous as the weeks went on. They stood watches 4 hours on and 8 off, in theory, the theory forever broken by general quarters, the call to battle stations that could come at any hour and that came, on the Enterprise, constantly. When it sounded, every man went to his station, the gunners to their mounts, the damage control parties to their positions, the engineers to their spaces, the air crews to their ready rooms, and they stayed there, keyed up and waiting until it was secured, which might be 20 minutes or might be all day. A crew that goes to general quarters at dawn and dusk every day, and again whenever a contact appears, and again whenever the ship is under attack, does not sleep the way human beings need to sleep, and the exhaustion accumulated across the months into a permanent condition. And around the danger and the exhaustion ran the ordinary human weather of a crew cut off from the world. Mail came when a ship happened to bring it, which might be weeks apart, and a man might learn of a birth or a death or the end of a romance in a bundle of letters that arrived a month after the fact, and then have nowhere to go and be alone with it, because there was nowhere on the ship to be alone with anything. The world shrank to 800 feet of steel and the same 3,000 faces and the same gray ocean in every direction. There was the crushing boredom of the long passages between the battles, the endless maintenance and drills and watches, cards and letters home, and movies on the hangar deck and the same conversations worn smooth by repetition. And underneath the boredom, always, was the knowledge that it could become terror in an instant, that the loudspeaker could call them to battle stations at any moment of any day, and that some fraction of the men going to those stations would not be coming back from them. It was a strange rhythm to live inside for years, long stretches of grinding monotony broken by episodes of pure violence, and it wore on men in ways that did not always show, and that many of them carried for the rest of their lives, long after they had come home from the sea. And laced through all of it was the specific knowledge of what they were sitting on top of. Every man aboard understood that the gasoline and the ordnance that were the whole point of the ship were also the thing most likely to kill him, and that a carrier, once it caught fire, could become a horror in minutes, as the men of the Enterprise had watched happen to other ships. They had seen the smoke on the horizon. They had taken aboard the survivors and the orphaned aircraft of carriers that had died. They knew what the ship could do to them if the wrong bomb found the wrong space, and they lived with that knowledge every day, in the heat and the crowding and the exhaustion, on a ship that kept steaming back into the places where it was most likely to happen. Set the numbers down, because the numbers are the frame the men lived inside. Over the course of the war, the Enterprise steamed more than 275,000 miles, which is more than 11 times around the Earth. She was in commission and in the fight for the entire war. She accumulated 20 battle stars out of a possible 22 for carriers in the Pacific. Her aircraft were credited with more than 900 enemy aircraft destroyed and more than 70 ships. She carried around 90 aircraft and, by the later years, close to 3,000 men. She held hundreds of thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline. She was hit or damaged in action on at least half a dozen distinct occasions across the war. At the Marshalls, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz, off Japan, and twice by suicide planes off Okinawa, and each time her crew patched her and kept her fighting, or got her home. And she was one of only 3 pre-war American carriers to survive the war at all, while 4 of her sisters went to the bottom. Those are the numbers of the most successful warship in American history, and every one of them was written by the men who lived inside her, and a great many of those men did not come home. The ship changed physically across the war in a way that made the crowding worse. When she was designed in the early 1930s, the threat from aircraft was thought to be modest, and she was given a light anti-aircraft armament to match. The war taught a different lesson within days, and from then on, the Navy piled anti-aircraft guns onto her wherever they would fit. Banks of 40mm and 20mm mounts and additional 5-inch guns, each one requiring a crew and radar and fire control directors and more radio equipment, each requiring more men until the ship that had been designed for a little over 2,000 was carrying half again that many. None of the extra men came with extra room. They were fitted into a hole that did not grow, packed into berthing and mess spaces that had been crowded to begin with, so that as the ship became more powerful and more capable, she also became more cramped, hotter, and harder to live in. The most successful carrier in the war was also, by its end, one of the most crowded, a ship built for one number of men and made to carry another, with the difference coming out of the comfort and the rest of everyone aboard. The casualty figures from her worst days are where the celebration stops and the reality begins. At Pearl Harbor, her scout bombers flew into the attack and 7 of 18 were shot down, with 8 of her airmen killed, making the Enterprise the only American carrier with men over Pearl Harbor that morning and the first ship to lose men in the Pacific War. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on the 24th of August, 1942, she took 3 direct bomb hits and 4 near misses, and 74 of her men were killed and 95 wounded. At the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands on the 26th of October, 1942, she was hit twice more, and 44 men were killed and 75 wounded. And at the very end, off Okinawa in the spring of 1945, the suicide planes killed dozens more. Those are only the worst days. Across the whole war, the ship bled men steadily, in 1s and 2s and dozens, in the flak and the fires and the accidents of flight operations, and the 20 battle stars are, read another way, a record of how many times her crew was asked to go back into it. In the spring of 1942, before the tide turned, the Enterprise took part in one of the boldest operations of the war, the raid that sent Army bombers to strike Tokyo itself. 16 twin-engine Army bombers were loaded onto the deck of the carrier Hornet, too big to be struck below or to land back aboard, a one-way throw at the Japanese capital, and the Enterprise sailed as the shield for the whole Enterprise, her fighters and scouts flying cover, so that the Hornet, with her deck full of Army bombers and unable to launch her own planes, would not be caught defenseless. When the force was spotted by a Japanese picket boat farther out than planned, the bombers were launched early, into worse odds, and they struck Tokyo and other cities and flew on toward China, and though the material damage was slight, the raid electrified a country that had known nothing but defeat and shook the enemy's confidence in his own home islands. The Enterprise had made it possible, and then she turned for home and was almost immediately needed elsewhere, because the next crisis was already coming. That next crisis was Midway, the battle that turned the war, and the Enterprise was at the center of it. in a way that shows both the glory and the cost in a single afternoon. In early June of 1942, the American carriers ambushed a Japanese fleet bearing down on Midway Atoll, and the fighting on the 4th of June came down to a matter of minutes. The American torpedo squadrons attacked first, flying low and slow and without effective fighter cover, and they were massacred, and among them was the Enterprise's own Torpedo Squadron 6, whose obsolete Devastators flew into the Japanese fleet and were almost wiped out. Most of the crews killed for not a single torpedo hit, but their sacrifice pulled the defending Japanese fighters down to the sea, and while the sky above the enemy carriers was momentarily open, the Enterprise's dive bombers arrived overhead, the Dauntlesses of her air group, led by a lieutenant commander named Wade McCluskey, who had found the enemy fleet by a combination of skill and luck after nearly running out of fuel searching. They pushed over into their dives, and in the space of a few minutes, they mortally wounded two of Japan's finest carriers, the Kaga and the Akagi, turning them into the burning wrecks that would sink and take the heart of the Japanese carrier force with them. It was the Enterprise's aircraft, more than any others, that won the Battle of Midway and turned the war in the Pacific, and it was bought at a fearful price by the men of her torpedo squadron, who had flown off her deck knowing what was likely to happen and had done it anyway, and whose deaths bought the opening the dive bombers exploited. The victory and the slaughter were the same event, and both flew off the same ship, and the men who armed those aircraft and watched them go had to hold both of those things in their heads at once. The clearest single picture of what that meant is the Eastern Solomons, on that August afternoon in 1942, because it is the day the ship was most badly hurt and survived. The Enterprise was covering the Marines who had landed on Guadalcanal, and a Japanese carrier force came south to drive off the Americans and land reinforcements, and the two sides found each other and threw their aircraft at each other across the water. The Enterprise's planes helped sink a Japanese light carrier, and then the Japanese dive bombers found the Enterprise. They came down out of the high afternoon sun, the Aichi dive bombers in their steep dives, and the ship threw up everything she had, the 5-inch guns and the automatic weapons filling the sky, and the bombs came down anyway. The first bomb hit aft, on the starboard side, and it punched through the flight deck and detonated below, and it killed the crew of a 5-inch gun gallery and started fires and blew a hole in the deck. The second bomb hit very close to the first, and the third struck farther forward and did less damage but added to the chaos. In the space of a couple of minutes, the after part of the ship was burning, men were dead and dying at their guns and in the compartments below, and the flight deck was holed. There is a famous photograph from that day, one of the most reproduced images of the naval war, showing a bomb bursting on the Enterprise's flight deck in a great black eruption. The man who took it, a Navy photographer named Robert Redd, was killed moments later at his post, still holding his camera, one of the 74. What saved the ship was not luck, but the damage control organization, and the men who made it work under fire. While the fires burned and the ship steamed on, the damage control parties went into the smoke and the wreckage and fought. They ran hoses, they flooded magazines to keep them from cooking off. They shored up the whole deck. They carried out the wounded and fought the fires compartment by compartment. And they did it while the ship was still under attack, and while the steel around them was hot and the spaces were full of smoke, and the possibility of a fuel explosion was always one spark away. And they won. They got the fires out, they patched the flight deck well enough to resume landing aircraft within an hour, and they kept the Enterprise steaming under her own power so that she was able to make her way back to Pearl Harbor for proper repair rather than joining her sisters on the bottom. 74 of her men had been killed doing it. That was what surviving looked like on the Big E. Not an escape, but a fight, won by the crew at the cost of their own. And after the fight came the part that the histories pass over quickly and the men never did. When the fires were out and the ship was steaming clear, the crew had to deal with what was left. The wounded and the burned filled the sick bay and overflowed it, and the ship's doctors and corpsmen worked on them with what they had. The burn cases, the hardest of all, men scalded by steam or caught in the gasoline fires, whose suffering the medicine of the day could do little to ease. The dead had to be gathered and identified where they could be, and prepared for burial and then committed to the sea, sewn into weighted canvas beneath a flag and slid over the side, sometimes a handful, sometimes dozens, in a service conducted quickly because the ship was still at war and could not linger. The damage had to be cleaned and shored and repaired, the blood washed from the decks, the wrecked compartments cut apart and made safe. And then the survivors went back to their stations and their watches and their crowded berthing and flew the next day's missions and steamed toward the next fight, carrying what they had just seen with them because there was no time to do otherwise and nowhere to put it down. That, more than the bomb hits themselves, was the reality of the war on the Big E, the living with it afterward, over and over, for years. 2 months later, at Santa Cruz, it happened again, and this time it left her alone. At the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in late October, the Enterprise and the Hornet, the last 2 American carriers in the South Pacific, took on a larger Japanese carrier force. The Enterprise was hit twice by bombs and badly shaken, 44 of her men killed, and her damage control parties fought her fires and kept her going once more. But the Hornet, her companion, was hit far harder, bombed and torpedoed and set ablaze, and she could not be saved, and she was abandoned and left to be finished off. And when the Hornet went down, the arithmetic of the Pacific War reached its lowest point for the United States, because the Enterprise was now the only operational American aircraft carrier left in the entire ocean, damaged, her flight deck patched, her crew exhausted, and there was nothing behind her. For a period that autumn, the whole of the American carrier war in the Pacific rested on one wounded ship. The men aboard her knew it. They took aboard the homeless aircraft and the survivors of the Hornet. They worked around the clock to keep their own damaged ship in fighting order, and they went back out, because there was no one to relieve them and nothing to replace them. There is a story often told that during this period, a defiant hand-lettered sign went up on the ship, reading that it was now the Enterprise against Japan, and whether or not the sign was exactly as remembered, it captures the situation precisely. One ship, hurt, was carrying the war. The Japanese, who kept announcing that they had sunk her, took to calling her a ghost because she kept reappearing after they had declared her dead. 3 separate times over the course of the war, her destruction was announced, and 3 times she turned up again off some island or some fleet, flying strikes, and the name that stuck to her, the Gray Ghost, was earned in exactly these months when a single battered carrier and her worn-out crew were, for a time, the entire American carrier fleet in the Pacific, and they held. 2 weeks after Santa Cruz, still damaged, with a forward elevator jammed, and a repair crew of civilian and Navy workers from Pearl Harbor still aboard and laboring as she sailed, the Enterprise was thrown into the decisive naval battle for Guadalcanal. In mid-November of 1942, the Japanese made their greatest effort to reinforce the island and destroy the American position there, and the Enterprise, the only carrier available, launched her aircraft into the fighting, even as her own hull was still being patched. Her planes helped sink a Japanese battleship and other warships, and helped break up the troop convoy that was the enemy's last real chance to retake Guadalcanal, and she did it operating with battle damage that would have sent a peacetime ship to the yard for months, her crew and the shipyard workers keeping her in action side by side. It was the same story as always, only more so. The one carrier left, hurt, sent in anyway, kept fighting by the sheer effort of the men aboard because the alternative was to lose. The campaign for Guadalcanal was won that autumn, at sea and on the island, and the Enterprise was central to it, and she did much of it while broken. For the men aboard, it meant weeks more without relief, on a ship that was quite literally being held together around them, in the knowledge that they were the last card their side had to play in the most important fighting of the war so far. That was the reality behind the battle stars, and it went on, in one form or another, for 2.5 more years. The Enterprise was repaired and reinforced and sent back again and again through the long grind up the Pacific, the Gilberts and the Marshalls, the great carrier battle of the Philippine Sea, the enormous fighting at Leyte Gulf, the strikes against the Japanese home islands themselves in 1945. She pioneered night operations, flying her aircraft in the dark when other carriers could not, which meant her crews worked around the clock in a way even other carrier crews did not. Year after year she was at sea and in the fight, her men living the same crowded, hot, exhausting, dangerous life, going to general quarters, arming and launching and recovering aircraft, fighting the occasional fire, burying the occasional dead, and going back out. By the standards of the ships that were sunk in an afternoon, she was fortunate, and by any human standard, the endurance her crew was asked for was extraordinary, 3.5 years of it, with the ship a target the entire time. The middle years of the war were for the Enterprise, a long procession of island campaigns and carrier battles that blurred together in the histories, and did not blur together for the men who lived them, because each one meant weeks at sea at battle readiness. She covered the bloody landings on the Gilberts, the assault on the Marshalls, the great raid on the Japanese fortress at Truk. In June of 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, her aircraft joined in the destruction of Japanese naval aviation that the American flyers called the Marianas Turkey Shoot, and afterward, when the returning American strike found itself over the fleet in darkness with fuel running out, it was the Enterprise and the other carriers that lit their decks and their lights in the face of the submarine threat to bring their aviators home. That autumn, she fought at Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, and through much of the last year, she served as a specialized night carrier, her air group trained and equipped to fly in the dark, hunting the enemy through the hours when the fleet had always before been blind, which meant that while the day carriers stood down at dusk, the Enterprise was launching, and while they slept, her crew worked. It is one thing to read the list of campaigns. It is another to grasp that behind each name on it was a crew standing watches around the clock, going to general quarters day after day, arming and launching and recovering aircraft in every condition, month after month, year after year, on a ship that was a target the entire time and had already been hit and burned more than once. The endurance was the story, the battles were only the punctuation, and at the very end, after she had survived everything the conventional enemy could throw at her, a new kind of attack nearly finished her, and it was an attack there was no defending against. In the last year of the war, the Japanese turned to the kamikaze, the suicide plane, the pilot who did not intend to survive, and who therefore could not be turned away by anything short of destroying his aircraft in the air. For a carrier, whose whole vulnerability was fire, the kamikaze was the worst imaginable threat. A bomb with a brain, aimed deliberately at the flight deck and the fuel and the aircraft. What it did to the men who had to face it was something separate from the physical danger, and the sailors who lived through both were nearly unanimous about it afterward. An ordinary attack, however terrifying, was a contest. The enemy pilot wanted to hit the ship and then go home, and the anti-aircraft gunners were trying to make that trade too expensive for him, and there was a logic to it that a man could hold on to. Against the kamikaze, there was no logic and no trade. The man in the aircraft had already accepted his own death and was not looking for a way out, which meant that damaging his plane was not enough, and frightening him was meaningless, and the only thing that would stop him was blowing him out of the sky before he arrived. The gunners on the Enterprise stood at open mounts and watched aircraft coming straight down at them, flown by men who were not going to turn away, and kept firing into them, and sometimes the plane came apart, and sometimes it did not. And there was nothing else anyone aboard could do about it. The waiting was worse than the attack. In the last months, the ship's crew spent day after day at battle stations under the threat of it, knowing that a single aircraft that got through could set the ship alight, and that no amount of skill or courage on their part could guarantee the outcome. Men who had been at Midway and at Santa Cruz, who had been bombed and burned and had buried their shipmates over the side, said that the kamikaze period off Okinawa was the hardest thing they experienced in the war. Off Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, the Enterprise, operating in support of the invasion, came under this kind of attack, and in April, a suicide plane hit her and hurt her, and she was repaired and came back, and then, on the 14th of May, 1945, it happened for the last time. A single Japanese plane came out of the clouds and dived on her, through the anti-aircraft fire, and crashed into the flight deck forward near the number 1 elevator, and its bomb detonated. The explosion was enormous. It blew the forward aircraft elevator, a massive steel platform weighing many tons, hundreds of feet straight up into the air, where it hung and turned over slowly against the sky in front of the whole ship's company before it fell back into the sea. Men who saw it never forgot the sight of it. It killed 14 men and wounded dozens more, and it tore up the forward part of the ship badly enough that the Enterprise, the ship that had survived everything, that had been the last carrier in the Pacific, that had been announced sunk 3 times and had come back every time, was finally knocked out of the war. She was too badly damaged to keep fighting, and she was sent home to the United States for repairs, and the war ended before those repairs were finished. It had taken a man deliberately flying his airplane into her deck to do what 3.5 years of bombs and torpedoes had not, and even then she did not sink. She only at last had to leave. That is the shape of the whole thing, and it is the shape of what her crew lived. The most successful warship in American history was successful because she was in the fight longer and more often than any other, and the price of that was paid by the men aboard her, who spent years in near continuous combat on a ship that was hit again and again, and that they kept alive with their own hands and their own lives until a suicide plane finally sent her home a few months before the end. The battle stars were real, so was the cost, and the cost was the men. What happened to the ship afterward is worth knowing because it is the last small injustice in the story. The Enterprise was repaired, and she came home, and when the war ended, she was given the job of carrying American servicemen back from Europe, thousands of them, ferrying the war's survivors home. Then the Navy had no more use for her. The country that had just been saved in part by this ship had, within a few years, a great many carriers and no need for a pre-war one, and the Navy declined to preserve her. There were campaigns to save her. Veterans and admirals and ordinary citizens argued that the most decorated ship in American naval history, the ship that had held the Pacific alone in the autumn of 1942, ought to be kept as a memorial. The money was never found. In the late 1950s, the Enterprise was sold for scrap and cut up in a yard in New Jersey, and by 1960 she was gone, broken up into steel and hauled away, and nothing of her survives today but her name, some fittings, her ship's bell, and the great bronze plaque of her battle honors. The Japanese never managed to sink her. 3 times they announced they had, and 3 times she came back. In the end, she was dismantled with cutting torches by her own countrymen, because nobody would pay to keep her, and the men who had served aboard her, many of them still young, read about it in the newspapers. One of those men was a boy off a failing Wyoming ranch named Alvin Kernan, and his life is the thread that leads out of the fire. Kernan was born in 1923 in Georgia, and his family moved to a hardscrabble ranch in the Sierra Madre Mountains of southern Wyoming, and he grew up there and graduated from the small-town high school and won a scholarship to the state university, and then could not take it up because he could not put together the small amount of cash the scholarship still required of him. So, in 1941, at the age of 17, to escape a ranch that was failing and a future that had just closed, he enlisted in the United States Navy, and he was assigned to aircraft carriers, and one of them was the Enterprise. He became an aviation ordnance man, one of the men who armed the aircraft in Torpedo Squadron 6, and that put him at the center of some of the hardest fighting of the war. At Midway, in June of 1942, Kernan was on the flight deck arming the torpedo planes of his squadron, loading and preparing the aircraft. And then he watched those planes take off, and he watched most of them fail to come back. The torpedo squadrons at Midway flew into the Japanese fleet low and slow, and almost entirely without fighter cover, and they were annihilated, shot to pieces by the defending fighters and the anti-aircraft fire. And of the men who flew off the American carriers in those torpedo planes, only a handful survived. Kernan had armed them and sent them off and then stood on the deck and understood, as the hours passed and the planes did not return, what had happened to the men he had just been working alongside. He was 18 years old. There is a particular cruelty in that job, and it belongs to the ordnancemen and not to the pilots. Kernan's work was to prepare the aircraft, to hang the torpedo, to check the mechanism, to make ready the machine that another man would fly. He handed them the weapon and then stood on the deck and watched them go, and there was nothing further he could do, and the outcome was entirely out of his hands from the moment the wheels left the deck. The men of Torpedo 6 were not strangers to him. They were the squadron he worked for, whose aircraft he knew individually, whose faces he saw every day in the closed world of the ship. And on the morning of the 4th of June, he armed their planes, and they flew off, and almost none of them came back, and the ship went on with the business of the battle around him. He would spend the rest of that day and the rest of that war around aircraft and the men who flew them, knowing exactly what could happen and exactly how little his own competence could prevent it. He kept at it for the rest of the war, and later he flew himself, as an air gunner in the back of a torpedo plane, over the fleet actions of 1944 and 1945, and he earned the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration the Navy gives, for what he did in the air in the last year of the fighting. He came through all of it, Midway and the Solomons and the Pacific battles and the skies over Okinawa, without a scratch. And he wrote later that as the planned invasion of Japan drew near, he did not believe his luck could hold into another year of war, that he was 22 years old and had spent his entire youth in a great war, most of it at sea in combat. And then the war ended, and he had held. And here is the turn, the thing that makes him the right man to end on. Alvin Kernan came home from the aircraft carriers, an enlisted man with a high school education off a dead Wyoming ranch, and he used the GI Bill, and he went to college. He spent a year at Columbia and finished his degree at Williams, and he won a fellowship to Oxford and took a second degree there, and then he earned a doctorate at Yale, and he became a scholar, and not a minor one. Alvin Kernan became one of the most distinguished scholars of Shakespeare and of Renaissance literature of his generation. He taught at Yale for 19 years and won its highest medals for teaching, and he went on to Princeton, where he served as dean of the graduate school. The boy who had loaded bombs and torpedoes onto aircraft on the pitching flight deck of the Enterprise, who had armed the torpedo planes at Midway and watched them fly off to die, spent the rest of his long life among the plays of Shakespeare and the poetry of the English Renaissance, and he did it superbly, and he lived to the age of 94, dying in 2018. And he wrote it down. Late in his life, he set the whole of his war down in a memoir, the ranch and the enlistment and the flight decks and the fire and the men who did not come back, so that what he had lived through on those ships would not vanish with him. And it stands now as one of the finest first-hand accounts of the war at sea that any American sailor ever wrote. He called it Crossing the Line, and the title is the last thing worth knowing about him. Crossing the line is an old sailor's phrase for the ceremony a ship holds when she crosses the equator, the rough initiation in which the men who have never done it before are put through an ordeal by the men who have, and come out the other side, changed in standing, no longer what they were when they went in. Kernan had crossed the equator on the Enterprise as a 17-year-old ranch kid, and he had crossed a great many other lines. Besides, out of Wyoming and into the Navy, off the flight deck and into the air as a gunner, out of the war and into the universities, from a boy who loaded torpedoes into a man who taught Shakespeare at Yale and Princeton. He understood that the phrase meant both things at once, the ceremony and the whole shape of his own life, and he chose it deliberately. That is where he ended, the Wyoming ranch boy who armed the doomed torpedo planes of the Big E and lived to become a Shakespearean, an old scholar in a university town who had once been 18 years old on a burning flight deck in the middle of the Pacific, and who chose, before he went, to write down exactly what that had been so that it would be remembered.